The envelope burned faster than the others. Kang Min-jae watched the corner catch first, curling black, the flame eating through the hospital seal before it could even be read. He held it over the kitchen sink with 2 fingers, the way a man holds something he has learned not to touch with his whole hand. Outside the window, Seoul glittered in the rain, and somewhere upstairs his wife was humming while she folded laundry, a sound so ordinary it made his chest ache. He had done this 11 times before. He told himself the 12th would not feel any different. It did. Adaeze Okafor's voice drifted down the staircase, warm and slightly off-key, singing a church song her mother used to sing in Lagos before either of them had ever heard of Korea, before either of them had ever heard of each other. She had no idea her husband was standing at the sink with ash falling from his fingers like snow that refused to be beautiful. She had no idea that the woman who couldn't get pregnant, according to 12 years of tests and needles and silent car rides home from clinics, was not her. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay a while because tonight's story is going to wreck you in the best way. Now let's get back into it. Adaeze came downstairs still holding a folded shirt against her chest, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw the look on her husband's face. She knew that look. 12 years of marriage had taught her to read it the way sailors read weather. Another bill? She asked, though she already suspected it wasn't. Junk mail. He rinsed the sink, watched the black flakes spiral down the drain. Nothing important. She studied him a second longer than she needed to. Then she smiled because that was what she did. She had built a marriage, a home, an entire second life on a foreign peninsula out of choosing again and again to smile first and ask questions never. It was a skill Lagos had taught her before Seoul ever got the chance. Dinner's almost ready, she said. Your mother is coming. Min-jae's jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the food. Mrs. Kang's son, he arrived at 7 exactly on time, the way she arrived at everything. With the precision of a woman who believed lateness was for people without discipline and childlessness was for women without value. She kissed her son's cheek and looked past her daughter-in-law like she was checking whether the furniture had been dusted. Still no news. Son, he asked, settling into her usual chair at the head of the table, though it was not her table. Min-jae said, low warning. I'm only asking. She unfolded her napkin with theatrical calm. 12 years is a long time to wait for a grandchild, Min-jae. I won't be alive forever to hold one. Adaeze set down the bowl of jollof rice she had made, spiced the way her mother taught her, the one piece of Lagos she refused to let Seoul erase, and said nothing. She had learned that silence in this house was armor. Sunhee's words slid off her like rain off a roof that had finally, after years, learned how to be waterproof. Almost. Because there was still, somewhere beneath the calm, a 13-year-old girl in Lagos who used to dream of a house full of children's laughter, and that girl flinched every single time. Min-jae reached under the table and found his wife's hand. He squeezed it once, the old signal. I see you. I'm here. It was the same gesture he'd used in a hospital hallway 9 years ago, after the 4th failed round of treatment, when Adaeze had cried so hard she'd made herself sick in a bathroom the color of old teeth. He had held her hand that night too. He had told her it wasn't her fault. He had known even then exactly whose fault it was. 3 weeks later, an international fertility and reproductive medicine conference opened its doors in Gangnam, drawing specialists from across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Among the speakers flown in from Lagos was Dr. Daniel Chukwu, a soft-spoken man with a reputation for finding what other doctors missed. Not because he was smarter, colleagues liked to joke, but because he was stubborn in a way that bordered on divine. Adaeze hadn't planned to attend. It was Min-jae strangely who suggested it. There's a Nigerian doctor speaking, you should go, you might learn something new. A suggestion that would later feel to him like the first domino falling in a line he never should have set up. She sat in the 3rd row wearing a green dress that reminded her of home. And when Dr. Daniel Chukwu began speaking about diagnostic errors in long-term infertility cases, something in her chest went very still. After the session, she approached him the way people from the same corner of the world always find each other in a crowd of strangers, drawn by an accent, a cadence, an unspoken shorthand. They spoke Igbo for exactly 4 sentences before switching back to English out of politeness to no one in particular. 12 years, she told him when he asked almost apologetically if she'd ever had a second opinion outside her regular clinic. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not pity. Would you be willing to show me your file? He asked. Not to interfere. Just humor an old colleague's curiosity. He laughed, surprised. You're not old. I feel old every time I see a chart that doesn't add up. She didn't understand not yet what he meant by that. She handed over copies of her records the following morning, expecting nothing more than professional courtesy, a kind stranger's second glance. Dr. Chukwu read through the file twice that night in his hotel room, and on the second pass his pen stopped moving entirely. Pages were missing. Not lost. Missing in the specific way that things go missing when someone wants them gone. Lab results that should have existed simply didn't. Dates didn't align with the timeline of her treatments. A signature on one hormonal panel didn't match the handwriting on any other document in the file. He picked up his phone at 11 at night and called a colleague in medical records compliance, and asked a question that would end up changing 4 lives permanently. Has anyone ever told this woman her file has been tampered with? If you're watching this and you've ever felt like something in your own life didn't add up, like you were being told a story that almost but not quite made sense, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Adaeze didn't sleep well that night, though she couldn't have said why. She lay beside her husband, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, and stared at the ceiling the way she used to stare at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom in Lagos, waiting for a future she couldn't see yet to arrive. Somewhere in that darkness, a decision was already being made without her. Dr. Chukwu requested a private meeting the next morning, in a quiet corner of the hotel's cafe, away from the noise of the conference. He didn't waste time. I want you to repeat every fertility test, he said. All of them. New lab, new doctor. Someone outside your usual clinic. Adaeze blinked. I've had 11 years of tests. What could possibly be different now? I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know your file has holes in it that shouldn't exist. And I'd rather be wrong and waste your afternoon than be right and let you keep carrying something that isn't yours to carry. Something in the way he said it, carrying something that isn't yours, landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward long after it sank. Does my husband need to know? She asked quietly. Dr. Chukwu hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Let's see what the results say first, he said. She agreed to the tests that same afternoon, telling Minjae only that a colleague from the conference had recommended a new clinic, a specialist worth the extra trip. He'd smiled, kissed her forehead, told her that was a wonderful idea, that he was proud of her for never giving up. He had no idea that 4 days later, a phone call would arrive that would end the life he had spent 12 years building on a lie. The results came back on a rainy Thursday, and Dr. Chukwu asked her to come in person rather than deliver them over the phone. Adaeze sat across from him in a small consultation room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and printer ink, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Mrs. Kong, he said gently, sliding a folder across the desk. I need you to look at this carefully before I say anything. She opened it. Her eyes moved across numbers she didn't fully understand, hormone levels and follicle counts and words in a language that had once ruled her entire adult life. What does this mean? Dr. Chukwu leaned forward, his voice steady, the way a man's voice goes steady right before he says something that will never let the room feel the same again. It means there was never anything wrong with you. The folder slipped from her fingers and landed open on the floor, papers fanning out like something shot from the sky. 12 years, she whispered. 12 years of injections. Surgery. My mother-in-law calling me barren at every single family dinner. 12 years of believing my body had failed the one thing it was supposed to do. Adaeze. And it was never me. She said it again, quieter, like she was trying to teach her own body a fact it refused to believe. It was never me. Outside, the rain kept falling against the window, indifferent, the way rain always is to the exact moment someone's whole life quietly breaks open. If there was nothing wrong with her, if 12 years of grief had been misdiagnosed, mislabeled, or worse, then somewhere a different question was waiting to be asked. A question with only one place left to look. Don't go anywhere. This story only gets heavier from here. And if you want to know what happens the moment Dr. Chukwu turns his attention toward Minjae's own medical history, you're going to want to see this through to the end. Dr. Chukwu didn't sleep that night either. He sat in his hotel room with 2 files open side by side on the small desk. Adaeze, and a second one he had quietly requested through a contact in hospital administration, using a professional pretext thin enough that he knew he was bending rules he had no business bending. Kang Min-jae's medical history, pulled from records connected to a private clinic outside the city, dated back further than the marriage itself. He found the accident first. A car crash 11 months before the wedding on a mountain road outside Gapyeong. Min-jae had walked away with a scar along his hip that Adaeze had traced with her fingers 1,000 times over the years, always assuming it was simply an old injury from a reckless youth. He found the diagnosis second, buried 3 folders deep, filed under a different clinic entirely, as if someone had gone out of their way to keep it from sitting anywhere near the rest of his medical history. Complete infertility. Confirmed by 2 separate specialists. Dated 4 months before the wedding. Dr. Chukwu sat back in his chair and pressed both palms flat against his eyes, the way a man does when he wishes, very briefly, that he had simply gone home after his lecture instead of accepting a coffee with a kind stranger from Lagos. Because now he understood. Not just what had happened to Adaeze's file, but why. Someone had swapped the story. Someone had taken a healthy woman and a man who could never father children, and rewritten the record so that the blame landed somewhere it was never supposed to land. And there was only one person with the motive, the access, and 12 years of practice looking his wife in the eye while doing it. Come on, don't scroll away now. This is the part where everything the audience thought they knew gets turned completely upside down. Stay with me. Adaeze confronted her husband on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen where he had burned the envelope 3 weeks earlier, though she didn't know that yet. She simply set the folder Dr. Chukwu had given her on the counter between them, unopened, and asked him a question she had never once in 12 years thought she would need to ask. Min-jae, is there something about your health you never told me? He went very still. Not the stillness of a man confused by the question. The stillness of a man who has been expecting it for years, the way people expect whether they can feel coming in their bones long before the sky changes color. Where is this coming from? His voice came out too even, too rehearsed, and she noticed because after 12 years she noticed everything about the way he spoke when he was choosing his words instead of simply saying them. Dr. Chukwu found my file had been altered. Pages missing. Dates that don't match. He thinks, she stopped, steadying her breath. He thinks someone changed the story on purpose. Min-jae's hand found the edge of the counter and gripped it, knuckles whitening, the way a man grips something solid right before the ground under him gives way. Adaeze. Just tell me you don't know anything about it, she said. Tell me and I'll believe you. I've always believed you. The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere far off, a delivery scooter buzzing down the street outside, oblivious to the fact that inside this particular house on this particular night, a marriage was standing on the exact edge of a cliff neither of them had seen coming. Min-jae opened his mouth to answer. And closed it again. That silence told her everything his words never had the courage to. She left the apartment that night with a single overnight bag, and Min-jae did not stop her because for the first time in 12 years he understood that stopping her would only prove he still believed he had the right to control what she was allowed to know about her own life. She stayed with a co-worker from the restaurant where she'd once trained, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Hannah who asked no questions and simply made tea, the universal language of women who have learned not to press a wound that hasn't finished bleeding. 3 days later, Min-jae showed up at Dr. Chukwu's hotel room unannounced, his tie loosened, his eyes red in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping either. I need to know what she knows, Min-jae said, standing in the doorway like a man who had lost the right to walk through it uninvited. She knows enough, Dr. Chukwu said evenly. I imagine you know considerably more. Min-jae's shoulders dropped, and for the first time since the doctor had met him, he looked less like a successful architect and more like a boy who had broken something precious a long time ago and had simply been waiting for over a decade for someone to finally notice the crack. I was 26, Min-jae said quietly. The accident. The doctors told me I'd never have children. I hadn't proposed to her yet. I could have told her the truth and let her walk away and marry someone who could give her everything I couldn't. But you didn't. I loved her too much to lose her. His voice cracked on the word love, as if even he no longer trusted himself to use it correctly. So I found someone at the hospital who could make the problem disappear on paper. I told myself it would only be until we figured something out. Adoption. IVF with a donor. Something. I told myself I'd find the right moment to tell her. 12 years is a long time to wait for the right moment. Min-jae said nothing because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse dressed up as an explanation. If you've ever wondered how far someone might go to protect the person they love, even when protecting them means lying to their face for over a decade? Comment below and tell me, could you ever forgive something like this? Also, quick reminder to hit subscribe if this story has you as hooked as I think it does. News of the separation reached Mrs. Kong's Sun Hee within the week, delivered not by her son, but by a voice she recognized immediately and had not expected to hear again in years. Yoon Seo-ah arrived at the Kong family home carrying a small box of imported pastries and an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind worn by people who have spent a long time rehearsing grief they don't actually feel. I heard about Min Jae and his wife, Seo-ah said, settling onto the sofa across from Sun Hee without waiting to be invited to sit. I wanted to check on you. This must be so painful after everything you've endured. Sun Hee, who had spent 12 years believing her daughter-in-law's body had failed her family, allowed herself for the first time a flicker of doubt. Endured because of her, Sun Hee muttered, though the words came out thinner than they used to, less certain of their own righteousness. Hyo-ah smiled the way people smile when a conversation is going exactly according to a plan they set in motion years ago. Perhaps, she said softly, reaching for Sun Hee's hand. Or perhaps it's time you asked yourself what you actually know, and what you've simply been told. Sun Hee frowned, an unfamiliar unease settling behind her ribs. She had no idea that the woman comforting her in her living room was the very architect of the lie that had cost her son his marriage, and that Seo-ah's sympathy tonight was simply the opening move of a much longer game. Because Seo-ah had been waiting 12 years for exactly this moment. And she had absolutely no intention of losing him a second time. We're just getting started. The truth about who really set this entire tragedy in motion is coming up next, and trust me, it's darker than anything you've seen so far. If you're new here, now's a good time to subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. Adaeze spent her days at Hannah's small apartment learning how to breathe again in a body that no longer carried a diagnosis it never should have had. It was strange, grief without a wound to point to. She had spent 12 years mourning a version of herself that had never actually existed, and now she didn't know which self to mourn instead. She went back to work at the restaurant, chopping vegetables with a focus that bordered on meditation, letting the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board fill the silence where questions used to live. Her co-workers noticed the change in her before she did. The way she stood a little straighter, the way she no longer flinched when someone mentioned children. Dr. Chukwu checked on her twice that week, always careful, always professional, always leaving just enough space between them that neither of them had to name what was quietly growing there. He wasn't trying to fill the space Min Jae had left. He simply happened to be standing nearby when she finally had room to notice someone else. You don't have to decide anything yet, he told her over coffee one afternoon, the rain from weeks earlier finally giving way to a rare, clean blue sky. Not about him. Not about any of it. I know. She turned her cup slowly on its saucer. But I keep thinking about all the years I spent apologizing for something I didn't do. I don't want to spend the next 12 doing the same thing just for a different reason. Then don't. She looked up at him, and for a moment the simplicity of his answer felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in over a decade. Meanwhile, Seo-ah's visits to the Kong household became a weekly ritual, each one chipping quietly at the foundation Sun Hee had spent 12 years building her cruelty on top of. She never said anything too direct. She simply asked questions, the way a skilled surgeon makes the smallest possible incision to do the most damage. Doesn't it seem strange, Seo-ah mused one evening, that Min Jae never once let a single doctor speak to you directly about her file? That he always handled everything himself? Sun Hee's teacup paused halfway to her lips. He said he wanted to protect her from having to relive the disappointment every visit. Or perhaps, Seo-ah said gently, refilling Sun Hee's cup with the practiced patience of a woman who had waited 12 years to pour exactly this kind of doubt. He wanted to protect something else. She left before Sun Hee could ask what she meant, the same way she always left. A seed planted, never a full sentence handed over. Because Seo-ah had learned long ago that people cultivate their own doubts far more thoroughly than anyone else ever could plant them. 2 nights later, Sun Hee called her son and asked him a question so direct it startled them both. Min Jae. Whose fault was it? Truly. The silence on the line stretched long enough that she had her answer before he ever spoke a word. He finally said, his voice hollow. Can you come over? There's something I should have told you 12 years ago. If you think you've figured out where this story is going, comment your prediction below. I promise you this next reveal is going to prove almost everyone wrong. Min Jae told his mother everything that night. The accident, the diagnosis, the bribed hospital administrator, the swapped files, 12 years of watching his wife apologize for a failure that had only ever belonged to him. Son, he sat frozen through the entire confession, her cup of tea going cold and untouched on the table beside her. Exactly the kind of small, forgotten detail that says more about a person's devastation than any tears ever could. When he finished, she didn't yell. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a point somewhere past her son's shoulder. Doing the arithmetic of 12 years of cruelty, she now understood she had aimed entirely at the wrong person. I told her she was cursed, son, he whispered almost to herself. At Chuziak. In front of the entire family. I told her a woman who cannot give her husband children is only half a wife. And it was you. Her voice rose now, cracking down the middle. It was you the entire time, and you let me humiliate her for 12 years rather than simply tell me the truth. Min-jae had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that wouldn't sound exactly as small and cowardly as the truth actually was. It was in the middle of this confession, this long overdue unraveling, that Min-jae finally asked the question that had been sitting unspoken at the edges of his mind for weeks. The question of how exactly 12-year-old medical records from an entirely different hospital had ended up quietly swapped in the first place. He had done it through a corrupt administrator, yes, a man he'd paid handsomely and never spoken to again. But someone had introduced him to that administrator. Someone had made the entire arrangement feel almost easy. He hadn't thought about that person in years. He thought about her now. Sia arrived at Min-jae's apartment 3 days later, uninvited, carrying the same practiced warmth she had spent weeks pouring into his mother's living room. She found him standing at the window, the city lights scattered behind him like something spilled and never cleaned up. I heard you told your mother the truth, she said gently. That was very brave of you. You introduced me to him, Min-jae said, not turning around. The administrator. 12 years ago. You're the one who told me he could make my problem disappear. Seoa's smile didn't waver, though something behind her eyes sharpened. I helped you, Min-jae. The way I've always tried to help you. Why? She crossed the room slowly, the click of her heels against hardwood the only sound between them. Because I loved you first, she said simply. And I knew that if I gave you a way to marry her without losing everything, you'd owe me something eventually. I just didn't expect it to take 12 years to collect. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height, and Min-jae finally understood, with a clarity that made his stomach turn, that the woman standing in front of him had not simply witnessed his greatest mistake. She had built the scaffolding for it, brick by brick 12 years ago, and had been patiently waiting in the wings ever since for the entire structure to finally collapse, so she could be standing there ready the moment it did. Everything you thought you understood about this story is about to change one more time. Stick around because the next reveal is the one that finally connects every single piece. And if you've made it this far, you already know this story is worth sharing. Drop a like if you're as invested as I am right now. Min-jae didn't sleep after Seoa left. He sat in the dark living room replaying 12 years through a new lens, watching every kindness she'd ever shown his family reveal itself as a carefully placed stone in a much longer path. The birthday gifts for his mother. The introductions to useful contacts. The way she always seemed to appear exactly when his marriage was under its most strain, offering comfort with one hand while, he now understood, tightening something with the other. He thought of Adaeze's face the night she'd left with a single overnight bag, and he understood with a kind of clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, that his silence had made him complicit in a plan that had never actually been his own idea, only his own choice to act on. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Chukwu, not Adaeze. He wasn't foolish enough yet to believe he had earned the right to call her directly. I need to report what I know, Min-jae said before the doctor had even finished saying hello. The administrator who altered the files. There's someone else involved. I have proof. What followed over the next 2 weeks unfolded with the particular speed of institutions that move slowly for years and then, once a wealthy man's lawyer gets involved, move very quickly indeed. The hospital administrator, a mid-level records manager named Mr. Bae, was placed on immediate leave pending an internal investigation once Min-jae's testimony, along with the financial trail of payments Dr. Chukwu had helped uncover, landed on the desk of the hospital's compliance board. 2 other doctors who had signed off on falsified test results without ever questioning why identical files kept arriving with suspicious gaps were named in the same investigation. The scandal, once it broke, moved through Seoul's medical community like fire through dry grass. A story too outrageous and too human not to spread. Seoa's name surfaced during the investigation's third week, buried in an old financial record connecting her to payments made to Mr. Bae years before Min Jae had ever approached him. Min Jae hadn't been the administrator's first client. He'd simply been the one Seoa had been saving for something bigger. She was brought in for questioning on a gray Tuesday morning, still composed, still elegant, still absolutely certain that 12 years of careful patience would somehow protect her from consequence. It didn't. The investigator assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Officer Ji-woo, who had spent 11 years untangling medical fraud cases most people assumed only existed in dramas, laid 3 documents on the table between herself and Seoa without ceremony. A wire transfer. A handwritten note, initialed but never signed, arranging a meeting between Mr. Bae and a man Seoa had once described in her own words as someone who needs a problem to disappear. A photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of Seoa and the administrator sharing a table at a restaurant 6 months before Min Jae's wedding. "I have no memory of this meeting," Seoa said, each word measured, unhurried. "Then perhaps your memory will improve," Officer Ji-woo replied, "once you understand that Mr. Bae has already given us a full statement in exchange for a reduced sentence. He remembers quite a lot." For the first time since anyone at that table had known her, something in Seoa's composure genuinely cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears, but in the small, involuntary way a hand tightens around the edge of a table when the ground beneath it has just been confirmed to be gone. Mr. Bae's statement, when it was later read into the official record, painted a picture uglier than even Min Jae had imagined. Seoa hadn't simply introduced him to a man capable of altering files. Years earlier she had used the same administrator to erase a debt of her own family's. A smaller scandal, quietly buried, that had first taught her exactly how much a man like Bae could be trusted to make inconvenient truths disappear for the right price. Min Jae had not been an isolated act of desperation on her part. He had been the largest transaction in a pattern she had been running for most of her adult life. Adaeze sat in the gallery on the day that particular testimony was read aloud, invited by Officer Ji-woo as a witness whose statement might later be needed, and she watched Seoa's face carefully throughout, waiting, she realized afterward, for some flicker of shame to finally surface. It never did. What she saw instead was something closer to irritation. The expression of a woman annoyed that a plan 12 years in the making had finally, inconveniently, run out of road. "Do you understand," the presiding officer asked Seoa near the end of the session, "that a woman spent 12 years believing her own body had betrayed her, because of an arrangement you helped put in motion?" Seoa's eyes flicked briefly toward the gallery, toward Adaeze, and for the first time, something almost human passed across her face. Not quite guilt, but the faint, grudging acknowledgement of a person forced to look directly at the cost of something she had always preferred to think of as a transaction. "I never intended for it to last this long," she said quietly. "It's remarkable," Officer Ji-woo said, not unkindly, "how many people say that right about the moment they're finally caught. If betrayal built quietly enough over 12 years could still be undone in a single afternoon, comment below what you think should happen to her. Because the internet has never agreed less on anything than what happens next in this story." Adaeze learned about the investigation from Dr. Chukwu, not from her husband, and something about that fact alone told her everything she needed to know about how far Min Jae still had to go before he'd earned back the right to be the one delivering news that mattered. She sat with the information for 3 full days before she agreed to see him, and when she finally did, she chose neutral ground. A quiet cafe near the restaurant where she worked, sunlight falling across a table between them like something too gentle for the conversation it was about to hold. Min Jae looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Not in his face, exactly, but in the way he held his shoulders, like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what walking upright without it felt like. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said before she could speak. "I know I don't get to ask for that yet. Maybe not ever. I just needed you to hear from me that I understand now what I took from you. Not just the years. The right to know your own story." Adaeze turned her coffee cup slowly, watching the liquid tilt and settle, tilt and settle. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she asked quietly. "It wasn't even your mother's cruelty. I could survive her. It was believing, every single day for 12 years, that my body had betrayed the one thing I wanted most in this world. I grieved a version of myself that never actually existed. You don't just get that back by telling the truth eventually. I know. Then you understand why I can't just. She gestured vaguely between them at the space where a marriage used to sit, comfortable and unquestioned. I can't pretend 3 weeks undoes 12 years. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. His voice cracked slightly. I'm asking for the chance to earn something. However long that takes. Even if the answer at the end is still no. She didn't answer him that day. But she didn't get up and leave either, and for the first time since she'd walked out of their apartment with a single overnight bag, that alone felt like something worth noticing. The investigation concluded 8 weeks later. Mr. Bay was formally charged with medical fraud and record tampering, along with the 2 doctors who'd signed falsified documents without ever asking the questions their profession required of them. Seoa was charged as an accessory, her carefully built reputation unraveling across Seoul society with the particular cruelty reserved for people who spent years pretending to be better than everyone around them. Mrs. Kang Sun-hee attended none of the hearings. She spent those 2 months instead in a kind of private penance, showing up unannounced at the restaurant where Adaeze worked, standing quietly by the door until someone noticed her, never once asking to be let past the threshold. It took 4 visits before Adaeze finally walked over and pulled out a chair across from her. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Sun-hee said, echoing without realizing it, the exact words her son had used weeks earlier. I know I don't deserve to ask for that. I just wanted you to see me sitting here. Not defending myself. Just sitting here with everything I did. Adaeze studied the older woman's face, lined now with something that hadn't been there 12 years earlier. Back when Sun-hee had first looked at her new daughter-in-law across a wedding banquet table with open, unhidden suspicion. You called me cursed, Adaeze said quietly. In front of your entire family. I know. I carried that word for 12 years. I know, Sun-hee said again, and this time her voice broke completely, 12 years of righteous cruelty finally collapsing into something smaller and far more honest. I am so sorry, Adaeze. I was so sorry, and I didn't even know how large the thing I owed an apology for actually was. Adaeze didn't forgive her that day either. But she let the old woman sit there in the small restaurant, until the tea between them went cold, and something about simply being allowed to stay felt, to Sun-hee, like the beginning of a debt she intended to spend the rest of her life repaying. We're almost at the heart of this story now, and I promise you, the ending is going to surprise you in a way you did not see coming. If this story has moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed because I have a lot more stories exactly like this one on the way. Months pass the way seasons do when a person stops counting them by pain and starts counting them by small, ordinary victories instead. Adaeze moved into a modest apartment of her own near the restaurant, close enough to Hannah's place that the 2 women fell into an easy rhythm of shared dinners and long, unhurried conversations that had nothing to do with hospitals or husbands or 12 wasted years. She saw Dr. Chukwu occasionally, though his conference had long since ended and his return flight to Lagos had come and gone twice, delayed each time by reasons he never fully explained and she never fully pressed him on. There was something unfinished between them, something neither of them rushed to name, content instead to let it exist quietly in the space where friendship and something more had not yet decided which one it wanted to become. Min-jae, for his part, did not disappear the way a lesser man might have, nor did he push the way a more desperate one would have. He simply showed up consistently in small and unglamorous ways, repairing a leaking pipe at his mother's insistence when Adaeze mentioned it in passing, sending no messages that demanded a reply, appearing at family gatherings only when invited and never assuming a welcome he hadn't yet earned. It was Dr. Chukwu, strangely, who first mentioned the orphanage. He had begun volunteering there during his extended stay in Seoul, drawn by a cause that felt close to the work he'd spent his career devoted to. Children whose stories, like Adaeze's medical file, had gaps where the truth should have been. He mentioned one child in particular during a quiet dinner with Adaeze one evening, almost in passing. There's a little girl there, he said. Half Nigerian, half Korean if the intake notes are accurate. Abandoned as an infant. Nobody's claimed her in 3 years. Adaeze went still over her plate. What's her name? Ariam. Means beautiful apparently. Though I don't think whoever named her knew that yet when they chose it. Adaeze visited the orphanage the following Saturday, telling herself it was simple curiosity, the kind any compassionate person might feel toward a child who shared a piece of her own complicated heritage. She told herself that all the way up until the moment a small girl with tightly coiled hair and enormous watchful eyes looked up at her from a low table covered in crayons and simply said in halting, careful English, "You look like the pictures in my book." "What pictures?" The girl held up a worn picture book about Nigeria, its pages soft from handling, clearly a donated relic from some well-meaning volunteer years earlier. She pointed at an illustration of women in bright wrappers carrying baskets on their heads. "Like them," Ariam said, satisfied as though she had solved something important. Adaeze sat down on the small plastic chair across from her, feeling something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. Min-jae arrived at the same orphanage 3 weeks later. As part of the community service arrangement his lawyer had negotiated in exchange for his full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. He hadn't chosen this particular location. Fate, or something that resembled it closely enough not to matter, had chosen it for him. He was carrying a box of donated books through the front hallway when he saw her. Adaeze sitting cross-legged on the floor of the play area. Adaeze sitting cross-legged on the floor of the play area, a small girl asleep against her shoulder, one tiny fist curled into the fabric of her sleeve. He stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, the box growing heavy in his arms, watching his wife. He still thought of her that way, though he knew he had no right to look more at peace than he had seen her look in over a decade. She glanced up and saw him standing there. Neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. "You know this ending is coming, but trust me, the way it actually unfolds is not what you're expecting. Stay to the end, and if you'd like the extended, unrated version of this story with everything that happened between Adaeze and Min-jae in far more detail than I could ever fit into a video like this, well, let's just say I might have something for you. More on that soon. For now, let's finish this the right way." "I didn't know you volunteered here," Adaeze said finally, careful to keep her voice even, the sleeping child on her shoulder rising and falling with each small breath. "I didn't either," Min-jae admitted, setting the box down slowly. "Court mandated. Part of my cooperation agreement." "Of course it is." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Only you would end up doing penance in the exact place I'd choose to heal." He took a careful step closer, stopping himself well before it could feel like an intrusion. "Who is she?" "Ariam," Adaeze said softly, smoothing a hand over the child's hair. "She's been here 3 years. Nobody's claimed her." Min-jae looked at the little girl for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. Not calculation, not the careful architecture of a man managing a crisis, but something rawer and far more honest than she had seen from him in years. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "She is." They sat together in that small sunlit playroom for over an hour, not quite as strangers, not quite as the couple they used to be, but as two people slowly, carefully relearning how to occupy the same space without either one of them flinching. It would take many more months before either of them was ready to call it anything close to reconciliation. There were arguments still to have, trust still to rebuild, one careful conversation at a time, a marriage that had to be entirely reconstructed rather than simply repaired. Adaeze did not move back into the apartment they had once shared. Min-jae did not ask her to. There were nights it nearly fell apart again. One evening, 3 weeks into their slow, careful reacquaintance, Adaeze found an old photograph tucked inside a book Min-jae had left at her apartment. A picture from years earlier, Min-jae and Seoa at some corporate function, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in the easy, unthinking way of two people who had once assumed they'd spend their lives together. Adaeze said nothing about it for 2 full days, letting the silence do the kind of damage silence always does in a marriage still learning how to survive honesty. When she finally set the photograph on the table between them, Min-jae didn't reach for excuses. "That was a company dinner. Before I ever proposed to you." He paused, choosing the next words with visible effort. "I know that answer isn't the problem. The problem is that you found something and had to sit with it for 2 days before you trusted me enough to ask. That's on me. That's going to be on me for a long time." It wasn't an argument that resolved cleanly. Adaeze left that night without finishing her tea, and Min-jae let her go without following, because he had finally learned the hard way the difference between giving someone space and disappearing on them. He texted her the next morning. Not an apology, just a photograph of Ariam's drawing from the orphanage, a small, ordinary offering that asked for nothing in return. She didn't reply for 6 hours. When she finally did, it was one line. "Thank you for not chasing me last night." I needed the room. That became, without either of them naming it, the shape their rebuilding took. Not grand gestures, but 1,000 small tests of whether the other person could be trusted with an uncomfortable moment. Min-jae started attending therapy on his own, twice a week at a clinic Dr. Chuk-woo had quietly recommended, and he never once mentioned it to Adaeze as proof of his effort, only as something he was doing because he needed to understand why he'd believed for 12 years that a lie born from love was somehow different from any other lie. Adaeze, for her part, allowed herself to be angry in ways she had never permitted during the marriage itself. Small eruptions over forgotten details, sharp questions asked without softening them first, the accumulated weight of 12 years given permission finally to surface instead of smiling itself into silence. Min-jae absorbed it without flinching, without once suggesting she was being unfair, because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had spent over a decade asking her to carry more than her share, and that her anger now was simply the bill for all of it finally coming due. Sunhee's own repair moved on a slower, more private track. She began attending the same small church Adaeze had quietly joined months earlier. Not the same service, not sitting anywhere near her, simply present week after week in a pew near the back, as though proximity alone might eventually earn back some of what her cruelty had cost. It was Adaeze, eventually, who invited her to sit closer. Neither of them spoke about what the gesture meant. They didn't need to. The real test came 6 months in, on the anniversary of the day Adaeze had first walked out with a single overnight bag. Min-jae remembered the date without being told, the way a person remembers the exact coordinates of the worst thing they've ever done, and he showed up at her apartment that evening not with flowers or an elaborate gesture, but with a single question. Do you want to be alone tonight, or do you want company that doesn't ask you to talk about it? She let him in, and they sat on her small sofa in near total silence, a documentary playing quietly on the television that neither of them was actually watching. And somewhere around 10 o'clock, without any particular ceremony, Adaeze rested her head against his shoulder for the first time in over a year. He didn't move. He barely breathed, the way a person goes still around something rare and easily frightened, until she was asleep, and only then did he ease a blanket over her and let himself finally believe that whatever was being rebuilt between them might actually hold. Dr. Chuk-woo, watching all of this unfold from the careful distance of someone who had once let himself imagine a different ending, made his peace with it in his own quiet way. He extended his work in Seoul another full year, not chasing anything, simply choosing to stay somewhere that had, unexpectedly, started to feel like it mattered to him beyond the conference that first brought him there. He and Adaeze remained close. The kind of closeness that didn't need a label, built on the particular gratitude of a woman who would never forget that a stranger's stubborn attention to a mismatched file had handed her back 12 stolen years of the truth. When people occasionally assumed there was more to their friendship than there was, Adaeze never bothered correcting them too forcefully, and neither, for that matter, did he. By the time the adoption paperwork was finally approved, Adaeze and Min-jae had settled into something neither of them tried to rush toward a formal label. They were not living together. They were also, unmistakably, no longer apart in any way that mattered. When the caseworker asked, during the final home visit, how she should describe their relationship for the official record, Adaeze looked at Min-jae for a long moment before answering. Right, that we're still choosing each other, she said. Every day. On purpose this time. The caseworker, who had processed hundreds of adoption files and rarely heard an answer that made her set down her pen, wrote it exactly as instructed. But every Saturday without fail, they found themselves in the same small playroom, sitting a little closer each time, watching a little girl who had never had anyone claim her slowly begin, in her own quiet way, to claim them instead. The full story of what happened between them after that. Every conversation, every setback, every moment that finally rebuilt what 12 years of lies had broken. That's not something I can fit into a single video. If you've made it this far, you already know how much I care about telling this story, right? And there's a longer version of this journey I've been working on, one with a lot more heart in it than 15 minutes could ever hold. I'll have more information soon for anyone who wants to go deeper into Adaeze and Min-jae's story. It was Sunhee, of all people, who first said the word adoption out loud. She had begun visiting the orphanage herself by then, an unlikely regular, showing up with homemade side dishes for the staff and small toys for the children, working through her guilt one quiet Tuesday afternoon at a time. She watched her son and the woman she had once called cursed sit together on the floor with Ariam between them, building a tower of blocks with the kind of patience neither of them had shown each other in years. and something in her finally settled into place. "You should adopt her," Sun-hee said one evening over dinner at the restaurant that had become, without anyone quite deciding it, their new neutral ground. "Both of you. Together." Adaeze set down her chopsticks. We're not even. I know you're not back together. I'm not asking about that." Sun-hee's voice was steadier now than it had been in months. The brittle certainty of her old cruelty replaced by something gentler and far more deliberate. "I'm asking whether that little girl deserves a family. And whether the two of you, together or not, might be exactly the family she's been waiting for." Adaeze looked at Min-jae across the table. He didn't say anything right away, which surprised her more than if he had rushed to agree. 12 years ago he would have answered immediately, smoothing over the moment before she'd even finished feeling it. Now he simply held her gaze and let the question sit between them, unhurried, the way real decisions were supposed to feel. "I'd like that," he finally said. "Whatever it means for us. I'd like to be her family if you'll let me." Adaeze felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound since the night a folder slipped from her fingers and landed open on a consultation room floor. "I'd like that too," she said quietly. The adoption process took another 5 months, filled with paperwork and home visits and the particular bureaucratic patience required of anyone trying to build a family through a system built to be cautious rather than kind. Adaeze and Min-jae were not technically adopting together as a married couple living under one roof. Their reconciliation, when it finally came, arrived slowly in careful stages, long after the paperwork for Ariam had already been filed. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, not a dramatic one. Min-jae showed up at Adaeze's apartment carrying takeout from her favorite restaurant, not because it was a special occasion, but because he'd simply thought of her while walking past it, the way a person thinks of someone they love without needing a reason. "I'm not asking you to come home," he said, standing in her doorway. "I just wanted you to know I still think of you, every single day, in the ordinary moments. Not just the big ones. I wanted to earn my way back into your ordinary days before I ever asked for anything more than that." Adaeze looked at him for a long moment, 12 years and 8 months of history standing between them in the doorway, and then she stepped back and let him in. They were married again, in a manner of speaking, the following spring. Not a second wedding, but a quiet renewal of vows in the garden behind the Kong family home, cherry blossoms falling around them like something the whole city had conspired to arrange. Ariam, now legally their daughter, stood between them in a small white dress, clutching a single blossom in her fist, utterly unaware that she was the reason 2 broken people had finally found their way back to each other. Sun-hee cried through the entire ceremony, unashamed, kneeling afterward to pull her granddaughter into an embrace so fierce the little girl laughed and squirmed to be let go, too young to understand the 12 years of penance that fierce hug was trying to make up for. Dr. Daniel Chokwu attended as a guest of honor, standing beside Hannah near the back of the small gathering, watching the woman whose file he had once questioned out of nothing more than professional stubbornness now standing in a garden full of falling blossoms with a family she had once believed she would never have. He had extended his stay in Seoul 3 more times since that first conference, each extension a little less about medicine and a little more about a friendship that had quietly become one of the most important relationships in his life, whatever shape it eventually chose to take. That evening, after the guests had gone and Ariam had finally fallen asleep between them on the living room sofa, Adaeze found the box. It was Min-jae who brought it out, a small wooden box with a handwritten label that read "The truth that set us free." Inside was a single unopened medical envelope, the very last one he had almost burned, months before Dr. Chokwu ever walked into a conference hall and changed the direction of both their lives. "I couldn't burn this one," he admitted. "I don't know why. I just knew somehow that it needed to survive." Adaeze held the envelope in her hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented, 12 years of grief that had never belonged to her, a lie that had nearly destroyed everything, and a truth that had eventually, against every reasonable expectation, set them both free instead. She didn't open it. There was nothing left inside it that could hurt them anymore. She placed it back in the box, closed the lid and set it on the shelf where it would stay, a quiet reminder rather than a wound, proof that even the deepest, most carefully buried lies could not survive forever against the kind of truth that refused to stop asking questions. Outside, the cherry blossoms kept falling, soft and endless, the way they do every spring in Seoul, indifferent to everything except the simple, stubborn fact of returning year after year, no matter how hard the winter before them had been. And if you've made it this far, Thank you for staying with Adaeze and Minjae's story from beginning to end. This one meant a lot to me to tell, and I hope it moved you the way it moved me while writing it. Let me know in the comments what part hit you hardest, and if you want to see the full extended version of this story, the one with everything I couldn't fit into a single video. Keep an eye on the channel because I'll have more information for you very soon. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next story.